In this video, we're going to discuss how to use the if function and the SUMIFS function in Excel. Okay, so let's begin by looking at the if function. So we can use if function to select values based on certain criteria. Okay, it could be one criteria or multiple criteria. Okay, we'll see examples of different situations. So let's take a look at this example 1 here. So what we have here is a data on the sales records of a company, right? Let's say this company is trying to pay a 10% bonus on the profit, right? But only if that profit of sale is bigger than $200, right? So let's see, how do we calculate a bonus based on this formula here? So let's call this bonus 1. Okay. So the criteria here is that the profit needs to be higher than $200, right? So we can use if. So after you type the if function and the first parenthesis, you can see that the first input in your function should be the logical test, namely the profit being higher than 200, right? So here we have the sales of the gross sales and also the cost of sales. So the profit is equal to column G minus column H. Right? So this would be G2 minus H2. That's the profit of this sale. And we want that to be greater than $200. So this is your logical test. Okay. And then next you see that the second input is the value if the logical test turns out to be true, right? So if this profit is indeed higher than 200, then the value we want to put here would be 10% of the profit, right? According to our assumption here. So that would be a profit, G2 minus H2 times 10%. Okay, so if the profit is bigger than 200, then the value of this cell is going to be 10% of the profit. Okay. Otherwise, there's no bonus, so the bonus will be 0. So this is if function. And we can apply this function to the entire column. So the second example, here the company is the same as before. It's going to pay a 10% bonus on the profit if the profit is bigger than 200, but only the East region is actually paying this profit, and other regions are not paying bonus. Okay, so let's think about this. In the logical test of the if function, we need to first say that the profit of the sale should be bigger than $200. So profit is G2 minus H2 for this sale, bigger than 200. And on top of that, we also need the region to be equal to East, because other regions, according to our assumption, are not paying bonus at this point. Okay, so we need two conditions to be true, this condition and the region being equal to East. So in a situation like this, we can use the AND function to combine two conditions. Okay, so we put AND and then parenthesis, the first condition, comma, the second condition, which is region name C2 equal to East. Okay. So the logical test here is given by the result of this AND function. Okay, so this whole thing will be true if both conditions here are true. Okay, if one of them is false or both are false, then this AND function will return false. Therefore, the logical test here will be false, right? And of course, you can put more than two conditions in the AND function, right? If you have 3 or 4 conditions in the AND function, then for the AND to be true, then everything there has to be true, right? Okay. So if both conditions are true, then the AND is true, then the if logical test is true, then we want to output the 10% of the profit, right? So that's equal to G2 minus H2 times 10%. Otherwise, we want to output 0 as the bonus. Right, let's move on to the next example. In example 3, this company will pay 10% bonus on the profit if the profit is bigger than $200 or if the number of units sold is greater than 15. Right, so here we have a column that tells us how many units are sold in each sales, right? So they're going to pay a bonus of 10% of the profit if the profit is high or if the number of units is large enough, right? So here the keyword is, although we have two conditions, but we don't have both conditions we don't need both conditions to be true, right? We just need one of them to be true. So the keyword is or. So let's see how we handle that in the if function. So again, we type equal to if. Before in this column, we used AND function, right? But now we're going to use the OR function. So the first condition is profit bigger than 200. The second condition is the number of units sold bigger than 15. And because here the keyword is OR, so if one of the conditions is true, then the whole thing will be true, right? If this condition is met, then we're going to do G2 minus H2 times 10%. So that's 10% of your profit. Otherwise, the bonus will be 0. And we're going to apply our formula here. Okay. Now let's think about how to use the if function to distinguish between more than two scenarios, right? So basically, each time you apply the if function, you can distinguish between two different scenarios, right? But sometimes you might have to deal with more than two. Consider this example. So we have some sales, and I would like to label the size of sales as either small, if the sales is smaller than 300, normal, if the sales is between 300 and 800, or large, if the sale is bigger than 800. Okay, so we have three different scenarios here. So if I say if, right, and I can say if A2 is not bigger than 300. Okay, so if A2 is not bigger than 300, then this is a small sale. So in this case, if this is true, then the value I want to print would be small, right? However, if this is not true, then we still have two different scenarios, right? So either normal or large. So we cannot just say normal or large here. It won't work. So what we do is we insert another if, right? So what happens here is the first if will consider this logical test, right? If this is true, then the function will be over and they will print small, right? If this is not true, then it will go to this value here to evaluate this function, this if function. Right? So this if function says if the sales is not bigger than 800, then we're going to print normal. Okay. Otherwise, we're going to print large. Okay. So if you think about this number, right? So 432. So A2, is A2 smaller than 300? No, that's not true, right? So it will skip this one and go to this function, if function here. And then it will ask, is A2 smaller than 800? The answer is yes, right? So that's true. This one is true. So the result here should be normal. Okay, so those are some examples of the if function. Let's look at another example. So in this example, we're going to use the if function to summarize the total value based on certain criteria. Okay. So again, let's consider the sales record. In example 1, I would like to calculate the total sales from the East region. So here we have the sales numbers, and these are where the sales are made. Right, so in which region the sales are made. So I just only want to sum over the sales that come from the East region. Okay. So we're going to consider three different approaches. First, let's consider using the if function. So I'm going to add a column in this table called sales of East, sales in East. Okay, and I'm going to do if the region. So here the logical test is that region name equal to East. If this is true, then I would like to display the sales. Okay. Otherwise, I'm going to set the sales to 0. Okay. And because this sales is indeed from the East region, so now this number is displayed here. The sales is displayed here. In the extend your formula, you can see that all the sales that are not from the East region are now set to 0. Okay, only the sales from the East region is displayed in this column. So now if you want to calculate the total sales from East region, all you need to do is to sum up this column. Right, so let's do that here. Okay. So the total sales from the East region is 24,901. That's the sum of this column here. So this is basically a two-step approach, right? First, we use the if function to select those sales from the East region, and then we use the sum function to sum them up. Okay. It turns out we can actually do these two things using one function, which is the SUMIFS function. Okay. So there are two versions of the SUMIF function. The earlier version is just called SUMIF, and the newer version is called SUMIFS. So the main difference between the two functions is that in the SUMIF function, you can only specify one selection criteria. But in the SUMIFS function, you can select multiple selection criteria. Okay. So we'll see the examples of multiple selection criteria later. Right now, we only have one selection criteria, which is region equal to East. Okay. Let's use the SUMIF function here. So I'll type SUMIFS. You can see the first input to SUMIF is the sum range. What are you trying to sum over? Right. So here we're trying to sum over the sales numbers. Okay. So I'm going to put the sales column. If you look at the formula here, the sales column as the first input. That's the sum. That's the sum range. Okay. So we can go Control backspace to go back. And then the second input, it says criteria range. So in this range, we're going to give the column based on which we're selecting the observations. So here we're selecting the observations based on the region name. So the second column is going to be the region column. So this is column B is the region column. So we're going to select the entire column. So that's going to be our criteria range. Okay. Control backspace. The last input is criteria. So this is the actual criteria. So the criteria for this example is that the region here in this column must be equal to East. Right? So here we can explicitly type equal to East, or you can just type East without equal. So if you don't type the equal sign, Excel will assume what you mean is that this column equal to this. Right? So this equal sign can be omitted. And now we're getting the same result. Finally, let's take a look at this older version of the SUMIF function. Right? So in this case, the main thing, if you want to use this function, the main thing to keep in mind is that the order of the inputs is slightly different from the order of this newer function. Okay, so in the newer function, the first input is the summed range. In this case, is sale. In the SUMIF function, you can see here the first input is range. So here, this is actually the selection criteria range, which is the region name in this case. Okay. So we're going to do region name first. And then the second one is criteria. So as before, you can do equal to east or just type east, the same thing. Okay, here I'm just typing east. And finally, the last column is the criteria range. So, the last input is the summed range. The last input is sum range. So that's sales here. We're summing over sales. Okay, after you enter everything, you can hit enter and you get the same result. Okay, let's look at another example. Here, I want to calculate the total sales of a product called Bellin. Right? So there are several products in the table, and one of them is called Bellin. And also, I only want to sum over those sales made in the West region. Right? So in this situation, we have two different selection criteria. One is based on region name, so I only want something from the West region, and the other is based on product name, so I only want to sum over those sales on sales of Bellin. Okay. Again, let's consider two different approaches. First, let's use the if function to single out those sales that meet these two criteria. Okay, so I'm going to say sales of Bellin in West. Okay. I'm going to use the if function to single them out. So here the logical test is, remember, because I have two different criteria and I want both of them to be true. So in this case, we need AND, right? So first of all, I need the product name to be equal to Bellin. And then I want the region name to be equal to West. And if both conditions are true, then this AND function will be true. So this logical test will be true, right? And then we move on to output the first value here, which should be sales, F2. Okay. If either of this condition is false or both of them are false, then this AND function will return false. So we move on to this value, which is 0. Okay. Now, the total sales of Bellin in West is equal to the sum of all these numbers here. Okay, so that's the result we're looking for. And next, let's consider the SUMIFS function. In this case, you basically have to use the SUMIFS function because you have multiple criteria, right? If you only have one, you can use either one of these functions, but now you can only use the newer version. So that'll be SUMIFS summed range. Again, it's sales. Let's go back here. So select sales and select criteria range 1. So this could be either the product name or the region name. So let's do product name first. So I want my product name to be equal to Bellin. Okay. Next, you can write the second criteria, which is based on region. So the region, if you look at this formula field here, okay, so this is the first criteria range, which is the product name column. That should be equal to Bellin. Like I said here, you can type equal to Bellin or just Bellin, the same thing. Okay, and the second criteria range is the region column, so which is the B column here. Okay, and here the actual criteria is the B column should be equal to West. Okay, again, you can say equal or not; it's the same. Okay. So that's the result we're looking for. Okay, so this is an application of the SUMIFS function with two different criteria. So you can see that in this text box here, you can add more than two criteria. You can add as many criteria as you want in the SUMIFS function. Next, let's kind of repeat what we did in example 1, because in example 1 we only summed over the sales from one region, which is the East region, right? So let's now sum the sales for East. So there are 4 different regions in this data, right? So now East, Midwest, South, and West. Let's calculate the sums for each region separately. So I'm going to type SUMIFS. So the summed range is sales, and the criteria range here is based on, because in this case I'm only selecting based on region, so the criteria range is the region column, and I want my criteria to be equal to East. So here I don't have to type quote East, right, because the East is already in this cell. So here I'm going to refer to that cell M14, and that's it. Before I enter this formula, because later I would like to drag this formula down to these 3 other cells, right? So here, if you want to drag your formula down, you want to make sure that you fix this F column and B column, right? Because here the F column and B column refer to the data set, right? So when you drag your formula down, you don't want these 2 columns to shift. You want them to be fixed here, right? And this M14, when you drag the formula down, will shift to M15, M16, and so forth. So this one you do want it to shift with your formula, but these 2 needs to be fixed. Okay. Hit enter. So now we know the total sales from each region. Next, let's consider a two-way summary. Right? So now I need to know the total sales of each product within each region. Right? So this cell should be the total sales of this Ballon product in the East region. Right? So this is the total sales of Ballon in the Midwest region, and so forth. Right? So for each cell, we have the combination of the 2 criteria. This is going to be somewhat similar to example 2, where we also have 2 criteria. So let's see how we type this formula up. SUMIFS, sum the range would be equal to sales, and the criteria 1 is, let's do product name first. So criteria 1 is the product column, and that should be equal to Ballon for this cell. Okay, so let me move this a little bit so you can see the formula. And the second criteria is going to be based on region name. So that's the B column, and the region should be equal to, for this cell, should be equal to East. So that's M20. Okay, that's your criteria. And close it. Again, let's read this formula again. The first input is the value we're summing over, which is sales. And the second input is the first criteria, which is product name. Okay, so column A is the product name column. So we want the product name to be equal to Ballon, which is N19. So that's N19. The second criteria is the region. So this column B is the region column. And we want the region to be equal to East, which is stored in M20. So region equal to M20, product equal to N19. Okay. So this formula would work for the cell, but again, we're going to drag this formula across this 2-dimension table here. Right? So you want to fix a few things. First of all, this is the sales column. This one has to be completely fixed. Okay, both the row and the column must be fixed because we're going to drag our formulas two ways, right? So you don't want to move your data at all. And I think this is the product name column needs to be completely fixed. Region column needs to be completely fixed. So because these three columns all come from this data table, they're not supposed to move. They need to stay there. And then you have this reference to N19. Right? So the thing about N19 is when you drag your formula down, right? If you don't fix anything, N19 will become N20, N21, and so forth. And we don't want that to happen. When you drag it down, it should stay here. So in other words, I'm gonna fix 19 here. Okay, M20. So for M20, when you drag it this way to the right, if you don't fix it, then M20 will become N20, O20, P20, right? We don't want that to happen. We want to fix that cell here. So we need to fix M. Okay. Now you can do Control Enter, Control R, Control D. So we have a two-way summary of sales now. Okay, let's consider the next example. So in this one, I would like to sum over the sales, but only for those sales whose profit is higher than $200. Right? So to just prepare a little bit, let me add a new column called profit. So as we know, profit is equal to gross sales minus the cost of the sale, G2. Right? And you can drag the formula down. So now we have the profit of each sales. And in our SUMIFS function, we're still summing over the sales. And our criteria column is going to be based on our profit. Okay. Do Controls backspace. Okay, so what's the criteria here? So like I said, if you want your criteria column to be equal to something, then you can omit that equal sign, right? But in this case, we don't want this to be equal to something, but we want this criteria range with profit to be greater than that something, right? So here, you cannot omit this greater sign. Right? So we have to type greater than $200. Right? And we hit enter. That would be the total sales with a profit bigger than 200. So what if we want to sum over those sales with a profit between 400 and 1,000? Okay. So in this case, again, we're summing over sales. So the first input, same. Criteria is based on profit, so the second input is still the same as before. What about the criteria? Here we actually need two different criteria. One is that our sales should be bigger than 400, and then we have to insert a second criteria, which is also based on profit. And this criteria says profit should be smaller than 1,000. Again, you cannot omit the smaller sign here. Okay, you have to type it up. Finally, let's consider another example, which is to calculate the total sales of products other than Sunshine. So here we have different product names, and one of them is called Sunshine. Right? Let's say for whatever reason, I would like to sum over the total sales, but exclude those sales of Sunshine. Okay, so let's see how do we exclude things. So before what we've been doing is to select something and include them in the sum, right? So now we want to exclude something from the sum. So again, SUMIFS sales criteria range. So in this case, it's going to be a product name. Okay, so what's our criteria here? So if I want to exclude something, I can just say not equal to sunshine. This is something, this sunshine is what I would like to exclude. Right? So here the keyword is not equal to, which is a smaller and bigger, the combination of smaller and bigger. Hit enter. Okay, so that's going to be the total sales of product. Okay, finally, let's look at another cool feature of the SUMIF function, okay, which is the so-called wildcards. So we have like a small record of number of visits by different IDs. Okay, so now let's say I want to calculate the total visits from IDs that begin with letter B. Okay, so we have different ID names, but I only want to sum over those IDs that begin with B. So this one begin with B and this one begin with B. So if you just eyeball this, you see that I should, if my formula is correct, I should be summing over these two numbers. Right? So let's see, how do we write a formula for that? We can say SUMIFS. Right? So the sum range is the number of visits, and the criteria range is ID name. So here the criteria is I want my ID to be equal to begin with B, end with anything. Okay. So here the wildcard is asterisk. Okay. So asterisk can be used in place of any sequence of characters, okay, including empty sequence. Okay. So B asterisk just means that something that starts with B ends with anything. Okay, this could mean B itself. It could be mean BAD. It could mean BD or B followed by anything else. Here we have two IDs, BAD and BD, that matches this wildcard pattern. Therefore, when you do the sum, these two records will be selected and included in the sum. Next. In example 2, I want to calculate the total visits from IDs that end with letter D. Okay, so here, if you look at this, you can see this one ends with D, this one ends with D, and this one ends with D. So if we're doing this formula right, then we should be summing over this number, and this number. So equal to, okay, starts with anything and with B, and with D. So if you sum over these in your head, you'll see that the sum should be equal to this. Example 3, I want to calculate the total sales of IDs that contain letter A. Right? So A could be anywhere in the ID. As long as there's an A in the ID, I want to include that ID in the sum. Okay, so the way we express this kind of situation is asterisk A asterisk. So remember, this one include anything. If you have, for example, BAD, that'll be the first B would be the first asterisk, the D would be the second asterisk, right? If you have this AA, then I guess the first A will be the first asterisk, and the second asterisk will just represent nothing, empty. Right? So remember, asterisk could represent empty string. So this would be the sum of 10, 5, and 22 and 16. Okay. Finally, let's calculate the total visits from IDs that have 3 letters with letter A in the middle. Right. So in this case, we only want this ID, and this ID, right? So for the first one, even though this one contains A, but it doesn't have 3 letters. So the criteria is, for this purpose, we're going to use the question mark. So question mark can only be used in place of a single character. So that's what we want here. This is the sum of this, and this. Okay, so we have 2 wildcards. One is the asterisk, so any sequence of characters, right, including empty string. Empty string just means nothing. Okay. Another wildcard is the question mark, 1 and only 1 character. So that's the difference between the two.